it is hard to understand what salmon do to these ecosystems. And you walk along a stream with salmon and it's just alive. It's splashing. There's flies buzzing on the carcasses. There's eagles, chittering. You might see bears. You might see mink. These systems are alive when the salmon are there. And when the salmon aren't there, they're quiet. They don't feel right. And I think they really bring life. And they bring life from that sort of ecological sense. They feed wildlife. More than 90% of grizzly bear diets come from salmon in some of these places with hyperabundances of salmon. Southern resident killer whales rely on Chinook salmon. So there's a lot of really important parts of this region, important wildlife, important things that we care about that really are sustained by salmon. And I think the same is true for people.
Hey everyone, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is all about water. It's all about fish and water. And after all, water is crucial to life, right? I think we often get sidetracked by the forests, right? We all spend time in the forest. We're always looking up, looking at these trees, these magnificent trees, and how long they've lived and what they provide and how awe-inspiring they can be. Sometimes we forget to look down and wonder and be inspired by the complexity and amazingness that is aquatic ecosystems. And so we're dedicating this episode to the idea of understanding how salmon watersheds are impacted by forest management. And understanding that relationship will help us go into the future in a more sustainable way. So, to have that conversation, I brought on Dr. Jonathan Moore. Now, he is a professor at Simon Fraser University of Aquatic Ecology and Conservation. He also is, and I'm going to get this wrong because it's Latin, but the Liber Aero Chair of Coastal Science and Management. Hopefully I got the Latin right. But he also leads the Salmon Watershed Lab out of Simon Fraser University. And he's obviously dedicated his entire life to researching and conserving aquatic ecosystems. So yeah, I just happened to have a paper come out recently too, explaining exactly that. They're detailing 75 years of experiments regarding forest harvest and impacts on watersheds. And so I thought it was good timing. Additionally, he brought on one of his graduate students, Carson, also out of the Simon Watershed Lab, and he added a lot to the conversation and understanding past experiences and relationships to salmon and understanding riparian zones and the needs for buffers and that kind of stuff. So, fantastic conversation. I learned so much. I want to thank John and Christian for coming on. It was great. Sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one sponsor. They have been with me since the beginning. I can't thank them enough for allowing me to do this the way I want to do it. Thank you, West Fraser. Very much appreciate it. Can't wait to keep it going. Also, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning. Thank you, Greenlink, for your support over the years. Now, let's dive into this conversation all about salmon, forestry, water, all that good stuff. Here we go. First of all, I like to get to know people I'm speaking with, and I think the best way to do that is just to ask why it is you do what you do, right? So in this case, we're going to have a conversation about fish and forestry and the impacts and that kind of stuff. And so we'll start with you, John. Why fish? Why is this something that you've dedicated your life to?
Yeah, the why fish question is something that I ask myself a lot. I grew up fishing with my dad and fishing for salmon, and I think that sort of, got me looking into the water a lot. And as sort of my education progressed, I realized that this is something I was as passionate about, trying to understand how these systems work and then have the information feed into decision making. And the reality is that salmon are critically important to the west coast of North America. And if you look at how cultures evolved, the thinking is that as salmon colonized following glaciation, they sort of set the foundation for indigenous people, and those sort of cultures co-evolved with the salmon over millennia.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the importance of salmon to these regions. And so that's a really deep motivator for the work that we do. And so I've been a professor at Simon Fraser University for about a dozen years now and lead the Salmon Watersheds Lab. And so we do try to understand how these systems change and then what to do about it, and with the goal of our work leading to thriving watersheds for salmon and people, though, too. And I've gotten a chance to work in watersheds from Alaska to California, and then more recently in British Columbia.
Awesome. I'm curious about, I'll dive into it a little bit here before we move on to Christian. So the crucial aspect of salmon, the concept is that for people that was like a food source, or was there something more to it than just that?
Well, I think it's every year they come back. Every year you have this sort of migration from the ocean to these fresh waters. And so you do have this reliable source of food, energy, protein. But with that, comes cultures that, stewarded them. And so It was, there's stories, there's laws, there's governance. They, really sort of cultivated those relationships in these ecosystems. So it was a pretty, I'm not indigenous, but I've heard from many of our partners that you can't overstate that importance, and that they're sort of a lifeblood of the coast.
Okay. So would it, again, I don't know if it's fair to ask you this question, but would it be equivalent to, like, say up in the Boreal, the moose is kind of the staple of a lot of indigenous people up here. So it's the same kind of thing. So like culturally, the main food source and cultural, I guess, lightning rod is the salmon down there. So it's all derived around that.
Yeah, I think salmon have been called a cultural keystone for this region. And so they are a key source of food. And, it's the coast, but these rivers are big. And so, people eat salmon thousands of kilometers upstream into the coast of North America. And it's not just indigenous people that rely on them. Also, they feel billions of dollars of economic support to the region, whether it's through tourism or recreational fisheries or commercial fisheries.
Absolutely. No, that totally makes sense. Cool. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. I appreciate the little backstory there. So, Christian, how about you? Fish, what's the deal?
Yeah, I'll probably just end up echoing most of what John says here. But,
that's okay.
Yeah, I think like it started from a kid. I always had a pretty big awe for the natural world. Like I was like classically the kid at the beach that was playing show and tell with every animal I could find. So I was just like running up to my friends and my parents with everything that I could steal from the beach. But then when I came to university in British Columbia, from the west of like Colorado and Utah, I saw my first salmon run, and that same kind of awe was supplemented like through my studies, and I got to learn about all those facets of salmon that John talked about, from like the ecological to the economic to the cultural aspects of it. And I was just so amazed at all the different ties of importance that salmon had on this region. And I hadn't really been exposed to that kind of icon before growing up. So it really changed the way I thought about people and how we're embedded in the natural world. And it really changed the way I thought about myself too.
That's very cool. Yeah. It's one of those just kind of aha moments, hey, where you're like, this is cool. This is something I want to learn more about, something I want to do more with. That's cool.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, and it seems to always be like unraveling. Like every time I've kind of worked around salmon for like 6 years now, and through different jobs, and now starting my master's with John, and everything that you dive into just keeps being like, oh wow, that wonder and awe just keeps kind of unraveling, which is really cool about them.
That's important. It's nice to continue to find new wonder and new awe in a job, right? Like it's that makes a big difference, right? Keeps you motivated, keeps you interested, keeps you just pushing for the next new thing, right? Very cool. Awesome. Well, I think we kind of answered this question a little bit regarding Indigenous peoples and some of the economic importance, but I think more specifically for people that maybe aren't in the environmental sciences, or maybe they're not hikers, maybe they don't spend a lot of time in on the coast. Why should non-anglers, non-outdoorsmen, non-scientists care about how fish are impacted by forest harvest?
Yeah, I think it is hard to understand what salmon do to these ecosystems. And you walk along a stream with salmon and it's just alive. It's splashing. There's flies buzzing on the carcasses. There's eagles, chittering. You might see bears. You might see mink. These systems are alive when the salmon are there. Mm-hmm. And when the salmon aren't there, they're quiet. They don't feel right. And I think they really bring life. And they bring life from that sort of ecological sense. They feed wildlife. More than 90% of grizzly bear diets come from salmon. And some of these places with hyperabundances of salmon, southern resident killer whales rely on Chinook salmon. So there's a lot of really important parts of this region, important wildlife, important, things that we care about that really are sustained by salmon. And I think the same is true for people. And so It's not just sort of wildlife, but, you go to a river that's full of salmon and the banks have anglers along them, and there's kids there learning to fish, and their dads or grandpas are there with them. And it's a way of life, and it's a part of food security for many regions and in many communities. And it's also the sort of intangible symbol of what is the West Coast, I think. You go to these watersheds with salmon, and there's salmon on the signs, there's salmon on the bumper stickers, it's a part of the culture. And so I think those are the reasons we should care. They fuel the economies, they fuel the sort of ways of life, and they fuel the ecosystems.
I like that. That totally makes sense to me. I'm reading a book right now and a passage that just passed through my mind last night when I was reading it was the research was showing that half of the world's $44 trillion GDP is completely dependent on biodiversity. When you trace it all back, it's true, right? So at the end of the day, even if you don't care about salmon, if all you care about is money, we need salmon.
Yeah, exactly. The other day I drove by Cabela's and the parking lot was filled with people going in there, buying new boats, buying new fishing rods, buying new lures, because the salmon runs are strong this year. It does power a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember reading once about, of course, and I don't know, to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the salmon run and for spawning purposes, and then after going upriver, they die. I was told that influx of this huge amount of nutrients from these rotting corpses, from these bodies, these fish bodies, is this massive influx of nutrients into the ecosystem, and it leaches into the land, and it creates further growth. Like it adds to the soil, it adds to the fungi, it adds to this more than just food. It's actually adding this like huge amount of nutrients into the landscape, keeping it healthy, keeping it rich. Is that true?
Yeah. So salmon make rivers flow upstream in many ways. Salmon carry the ocean to these coastal forests and the wildlife. And I forget the numbers, but it's millions of pounds of fertilizer each year is basically deposited to these forests and ecosystems by this migration of salmon. And so, those nutrients, that nitrogen and that phosphorus from their decaying bodies goes into these trees, it goes into the streams, and it's what help grows, the young fish in these ecosystems that also help, feed the grizzly bears, as I mentioned. And it makes these ecosystems thrive. They're different because of salmon.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another level of contribution like that. I'm always in awe at the idea of, okay, we're going to reproduce and then we're going to die. And it's just like, they're like, yeah, we're committed to this. It's fine. I'm cool with that. And it's just like, wow, that's a commitment. Good for you. But yeah, so
salmon give everything, right? And that's what's amazing is they literally give everything to the next generation. And the salmon in the ocean, you look at it and it's silver bright. And if you fillet it out, the flesh is red. But then as it migrates upstream and as it gets ready to spawn, that flesh turns to mush because they're pumping all of their nutrients, all of that energy, all of those sort of rich, beta carotenes and all the sort of stuff that the eggs need into their eggs. And they don't save anything for the journey home. And so by the time a salmon spawns and dies, it's literally given everything to the next generation.
Yeah. Some of the images of those salmon nearing the end of that spawning journey, they just look like zombies almost. Like they're just like falling apart. You're like, how is that thing still going? Like the dedication is amazing.
Yeah, it is inspiring and kind of humbling. I've literally seen salmon where a bear has taken a huge chunk out of their back and you can see their vertebrae and they're still trying to swim upstream. There was this one salmon we called Headless Harry, and a bear had bitten part of its head off, and you could actually kind of see into its brain case. But it was still like trying to mate with the females around.
Nothing's going to stop me.
Yeah, the motivation is insane.
Who needs a head, right? That's wild. So jumping into the lab. So the Salmon Watershed Lab. This is your lab, correct, John? You started this?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I lead the lab.
Okay, so what was? I don't think I need to ask you what the motivation was for the lab, but what is the function of the lab? What's the question you're hoping to answer? What are you aiming for?
Yeah, so we're a team of scientists, and it's grad students like Christian and research scientists and undergrads, and we try to understand how salmon ecosystems are changing. And then we also work with diverse partners to try to link that knowledge to potential paths forward. Okay. And so we really try to work collaboratively. We try to really listen to the local experts and to try to tackle the problems that are of relevance to folks. And so I think that's important for this conversation also, is that we're coming into this conversation as fish ecologists. We think about salmon, we think about rivers, we think about watersheds and what affects them.
Okay.
And so we're coming in with that training. And the reality is that, our motivation for this work is because these watersheds that salmon call home are also places that we call home. And forestry is a big part of these landscapes. And so some of the work that we've done has been on forestry because of that, because forestry is a large part of the use of some of the places that salmon call home too.
Mm-hmm. So one of the big things I found when I was diving into this idea of salmon and forestry and the papers that you guys have put out is there's a bunch of stuff going on here. Like I saw that there's that big Carnation Creek long-term study and exhaustive study. It's been 30 years or something it's been going on?
Upwards of 50 now.
50 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot of focus on this type of stuff. And so there's lots to unpack, lots that we're trying to figure out. I think before we dive into it, I want to try to kind of lay the groundwork for this relationship between salmon and forestry. And, how do we begin kind of that conversation? So I think we need to start with, what are we measuring when we're talking about the relationship between salmon and forest harvest?
Yeah. Could I situate us like potentially where forestry and fish are at kind of now? Because I think before we get into what we're measuring, I feel like as researchers on forestry, there was a lot of things that happened before the research was actually done. So I kind of just want to, could I lay the land real quick?
Absolutely. Let's paint a picture however you want to paint it. I think the most important thing that I'm trying to get across here is clarity. So
okay. Yeah.
As much as we can get it.
Yeah. So I think this is obviously from the perspective of researchers, and the relationship with forests, fish, and people is different to different groups. But from the research perspective, research on fish in response to forestry only really started in the 60s. But the effects of forestry obviously started much earlier when forestry as an industry came about. So forestry kind of increased throughout time and its reach and its intensity with industrialization and logging, and it's to what we know it is today, which is a really big commercial sector. But by the time research started rolling out, a lot of forests were changed pretty substantially. So I think there was a stat in the lower 48 of the US that over 70% of the initial forests remain, but of all those forests, a lot of the distribution and the makeup of that has dramatically changed. So where we landed by the 60s and starting that research, most of the forests had changed quite a bit. And those changes were through practices that didn't really have a lot of considerations for fish. So like a pretty jarring one was the creation of splash dams and log drives, which are splash dams were these, they don't exist anymore, but they went up to kind of the start of research and policies for protection of fish. And they were these artificial dams that logging companies would create that would raise water levels in streams that they could use to drive logs downstream to transport the logs towards sawmills. And so obviously that was like super destructive towards fish because your river environment changed from a stream to a reservoir if you were upstream of the dam. And then if you were downstream of the dam, you had limited habitat to go through because you kind of your whole habitat got completely truncated. So those kind of changed with the first policies and research that started to mount in the 60s. And you saw less and less of that. And there were some big policy gains. For instance, like in the 70s, there was the first implementation of riparian buffers and around streams that allow for vegetation to be retained when people are harvesting.
So you're not cutting right up to the stream. You're leaving some kind of buffer between the stream and the harvest. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a big agreement policy-wise that those were needed to be in place for all the benefits that they provide fish. And so those have kind of increased throughout time. But overall, when those policies started being put in place, the landscape itself was really different.
That makes sense. So like you're saying that by the time we started measuring, our baselines were already changed. So we already don't know what's going on. So we're starting from a place of loss already. So okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's thinking about the log drive. I was just sitting here thinking about the log driver's waltz, and now I got to feel bad about that. Damn, that's a Canadian icon of a song, right? But you always wondered, right? Like how the idea of floating logs down the river, and you're like, that's an interesting. Like, sure, it's probably a cheap way to move stuff, but yeah, I got to imagine that it definitely had an impact on how the stream functioned, for sure, without a doubt.
Yeah.
So not really surprising, but yeah. So obviously since the 60s, since research started happening, the policy changes, we're starting to get a few changes. And like you said, I think, right, it was these changes came in with the recognition that, we need to start, we can't just be harvesting, we need to be thinking about these other values as well, because it's possible to detrimentally impact them. And so we need to start adding in buffers or whatever else might be there. So what are the types of things that we're measuring when it comes to how the river is changing as a result of forest harvest?
Yeah. So like John said earlier, I think our backgrounds are mostly in fish. So I think like we could start with the things that are important to fish.
Okay.
There's this term called like a master variable that gets thrown around a lot when it comes to fish. And those are basically these critical kind of groupings or categories that are really important to a fish's life and like determines how well they do. And they can be grouped into like three major categories. There's like water quality. There's habitat in terms of its quality and quantity, and then there's also flow, and those like exist both in freshwater environments and also saltwater. But when it comes to water quality, those are things that we might think of like water temperature, oxygen levels, the clarity of the water, how acidic it is. And one of the most important ones is temperature, because when it comes to fish, they're cold water species, and temperature will influence virtually every aspect of a fish. Uh-huh. So from how fast the eggs hatch to how big juveniles grow when they're living in the river before they go out to sea, and their swimming ability and how far they can jump, all these things are going to be influenced by temperature, because it's like the immediate interface of what affects their metabolism. So water quality. And then there's flow, which is kind of that controls the physical environment of the stream, and in turn the fish themselves. So how fast the water is flowing, how much of it's flowing, and where it's flowing, and that those kind of determine both the physiological and the distribution of fish. So where they are and where they can feed, and it can even influence like a lot of physical dynamics. Like for instance, how much light penetrates the water can be influenced by flow, or how cold the water is too. So that's where these things start to get reciprocal. And then the third major master variable for fish would be habitat. Good example of that is spawning gravel. So that can be a pretty significant limiting factor for adults that are coming home. When they're spawning, they need a pretty specific range of sizes of gravel, depending on the species, for laying their eggs. And the amount of that and the quality of that really dictates how well the population can do in spawning. And then obviously for the eggs that emerge out of that sediment and then grow to be juveniles that end up living in the rivers, the amount of cover from predators, the amount of habitat matters for them as well.
Okay. Gotcha. So really just like anything you can think of about a river and how it might and how it might change is important and to understand. And any change to the adjacent forest cover has some kind of reciprocal change to the watershed as a result of that alteration. So we need to be taking that all into consideration. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah. And so just to chime in on this one, I think as Christian mentioned, there's all these direct and indirect pathways of impact of any given sort of activity in a watershed, such as forestry. And so in terms of trying to understand its impact, then it is a complicated problem, right? Because it could be any one of these sort of pathways. Right. And so there's all these things that could be measured. And the reality is that there, as you alluded to, there's a few places where there are these intensively monitored watersheds that we've learned a lot from, the Carnation Creeks of the world, for example. But it's also important to note there isn't sort of like a systematic monitoring of all places where forestry happens. That's the sort of beyond the scope of what's done currently. And it would be quite challenging just in terms of what it would entail. So those are the pathways of impact, and they aren't monitored in most places where forestry happens, I believe. Okay, good to know. So can we jump into how exactly, we don't have to get too crazy in depth, but just I want to try to paint a picture of, like, let's say that there's a salmon river close to a location where there's going to be a forest harvest. How exactly does that forest harvest alter the watershed? Like, what's the process? I'm trying to paint a picture of how the removal of trees changes those factors that you just mentioned, Christian.
Yeah. So I think, like John said, and like we both mentioned, there's a lot of different pathways and a lot of different drivers. But I think we could start with one driver from forestry and just go from there.
Yeah, of course.
So I think a good one that I'm most familiar with, because my master's research is like stream vegetation. So the riparian area, which is basically the zone at which the forest meets the stream, that area can have a really big influence on watersheds. So when that area gets harvested, there's a lot of different pathways that can influence fish. One of the main ones is through temperature. So when you remove that vegetation, there's going to be more direct sunlight that hits the stream, and that can raise temperatures immediately there. But there's also at the entire like level of the watershed. So if you have clear cutting and that riparian canopy is removed, you have more soils that are wetted and that are kind of draining into the watershed and that are also exposed to more sunlight. So you have it at the immediate level to the stream, and then at the larger level of the watershed too, that could be increasing temperature.
Gotcha.
And then like for structure and flow, that riparian area, when the trees are removed, that can influence a few things. One of the biggest is the recruitment or the displacement of wood into the streams. So these streams are naturally pretty complex, and they wind and they bend, and what makes them look so alive is how many decomposing and then growing trees there are that are being thrown into the rivers. And without that riparian area as a source for that wood, rivers start to straighten out quite a bit and don't have that complexity. So that wood can not only like modulate flows and create habitat for fish to sit in that is like safeguarded from higher flows, but it also can create habitat for them to rear in, to avoid predators, for them to feed in. That net contribution of trees can create dynamics for flow and habitat for them.
That's crazy. That's one aspect I've never thought about. The fact that the removal of trees, in the riparian area would actually change the way, like the waviness or the oxbow nature of a river. It might straighten it out. Like I never even thought about that. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are some big trees that we're talking about, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So
yeah, that's something else. That's okay. Interesting. So, and then I got to imagine that just the removal of trees, like say in a clear cut situation or whatever, that would just impact the amount of water hitting the river in general, as there's less vegetation to take it up. There's less evapotranspiration. There's just everything. So everything's kind of shifted all of a sudden.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and then with that forest removal, it's the kind of like the natural filter that the forest provides, whether it's at the riparian area or the cut block in the larger catchment, because those roots are taken up, and there's also more water going through. There's going to be a lot more sediment and erosion coming through the system as well, yeah. And so that sediment at the scale of the watershed also contributes to that kind of straightening of the river, where you have these pools that are going to fill up with sediment over time, and slowly there will be banks that start to form, and everything kind of just gets more efficient. So generally, as it starts, as like the process of sedimentation increases or erosion happens and more fine sediment moves through the system, the stream itself gets wider and faster. And it just gets it gets better at
moving water, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's interesting. Okay. So then, so all of these things are, when we talk about the impacts of forestry on water quality and habitat and flow and that kind of thing, my brain always goes to the idea of, how does that compare? And I don't know that you guys have this answer because you're a fish lab, you're not a fire lab or whatever. But I'm always curious as to how that compares to, say, like fire, right? Like natural disturbance. And I'm trying to I want to try to create some kind of natural comparison where we can discuss maybe where we can understand the scope of this impact. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an important and tricky question. I think watersheds have natural disturbances, and so salmon have evolved in these watersheds that do have fires and do have landslides. The reality is that forestry is quite prevalent across them, and so it's added a huge disturbance to landscapes on top of these natural disturbance regimes. Mm-hmm. The thing about like fire is it's incredibly variable. And so it's hard to sort of generalize. If you think about a typical fire, they oftentimes don't burn through the riparian areas, and they're quite variable in terms of burn severity. And so I think that sort of typical fire that isn't incredibly severe, the impacts might not be very big actually on aquatic ecosystems.
Okay.
Just from a personal experience, I worked on one watershed that did have a forest fire, and just seeing it burn was crazy. But that warmed the river, the next year it was less than a degree warmer. And so it warmed up a tiny bit that we could detect, but pretty minor. And then that compares to some of the impacts of forestry that studies have found of, warming streams several degrees during the summer months at least. And so just from that metric, sort of a moderate burn in terms of water temperature might be less severe than forestry. But it is hard to know, right? Like a very severe wildfire that burns through the soils and leads to sort of catastrophic slope failure that will have a big impacts on the watershed. But I guess I'll just sort of reemphasize the point that I think it is important to think about these natural disturbances. But the reality is that forestry is adding on top of the sort of natural disturbance regime. So even if we mimic the impacts of a wildfire per se with forestry, we need to be thinking about how that cumulatively is adding to the pressures put on these landscapes and watersheds and fish.
At the end of the day, we want the fish populations to be healthy, regardless of what's going on upstream. We need to manage it to make sure that continues to happen. So, yeah, I suppose I feel the need to ask the question in regards to, like I'm kind of thinking of what is acceptable levels of impact, right? Like we know there'll probably always be a certain level of forest harvest. So how do we, my thought always goes to how do we do that in the most sustainable way possible that is reducing negative impact, right? Reducing risk, reducing whatever that kind of, so I think to me, the natural progression is always to look at how the forest is naturally disturbed, how that impacts the resource we're talking about, and then try to, like you said, mimic that. But then, like you said, if the mimicking of that is outside the scope of natural disturbance regime, then it doesn't matter because it's still adding to the issue. So,
yeah, it's a tricky question. I agree that forestry is important. We need wood, and it's important industry. And so the question is, well, what are the risks posed by different forestry practices, and how can those risks be mitigated? And at some level, that is actually, it can be a science-based question, but it's not a scientific question. It's a question that's based on sort of human values and what we prioritize and what level of risk is acceptable. And I think the role of science is to sort of help say, okay, if you do this, then this might happen, or there might be, this increased probability of something that might be a negative outcome.
Yeah.
And I know that some forest policy has been sort of built on trying to mimic the idea of natural disturbance regimes. And I understand that, but I do, again, just caution with the fact that from a broad scale perspective, if we look at, all right, salmon across, a broad region, even if we mimic forestry, we need to think about how much, even if forestry mimics fires, we need to think about what proportion of the watersheds are being altered by both those processes at the same time. And so I think it is really important to sort of have that broad landscape level perspective of both natural and human caused disturbances.
Yeah. And I think posing that question for me also, it kind of serves a twofold purpose, right? Because I also see the, folks out there that try to do everything in their power to justify more harvest or different versions of harvest, right? And so I see this as an opportunity to kind of remove the doubt and remove the questions that maybe people would automatically go to kind of justify certain decisions. So I see this as that kind of an opportunity, right? To put clarification into why that's not a fair comparison or whatever. So it's
great.
Yeah, I think it's just important to be like, the more clear we can be in the impact we're having and how that compares to natural stuff, the easier it is for us to recognize where we're having a detrimental impact, and the easier it is for us to make a better, different decision, right? So I think that's why breaking these down so specifically is important. And especially like what you said, right? It's not really a scientific question because we don't have $1 trillion to put into answering it. We have to hedge our bets and kind of it's human values and what we want to protect and what we want to conserve. And so it is challenging no matter what way you spin it.
Yeah, I agree that it is important to get that sort of scientific foundation right, because I think that can be sort of a platform for shared conversations about how we want our watersheds to look and what the trade-offs might be and what the opportunities might be. And then based on getting that sort of shared common understanding, then sort of really be thinking about the different values and rights that should be brought to the table in these decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so challenging, right? Like trying to decide what is an acceptable level of impact, and like how do we do this in a reciprocal way that you're not degrading the landscape. And it's such a big question. There's so much complexity that it just requires this like nitpicky approach where you're slowly picking away at the problem, slowly figuring things out, slowly hedging our bets. But at some point, slowly doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
I hope in this conversation to try and provide some clarity about certain things that, forestry or, forest harvest can do to try to minimize those types of impacts. And I suppose part of the problem there is like we mentioned before, right? The baseline issue. Like we don't know what levels of impact were prior to colonization, prior to forest harvest. So it's hard to know what we can have now, especially with more people on the landscape and more activity. And forestry is not the only thing going on, right? There's also urban sprawl, and there's oil and gas, and there's mining, and there's all kinds of other stuff too. So there's this huge cumulative impact, and it's such a big question to try and nail down. So how would you go about? I don't know if this is a fair question, but how would you go about determining a baseline from which to compare to it for kind of a target, something to aim for as far as our impact on salmon watersheds?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things that I think needs to be continued to be prioritized is having some of these places that are really well studied and that can be viewed as these long-term experiments. And so watersheds where different forestry treatments are put forth on the land, and then the stream ecosystem and its fish are well monitored. And studies like Carnation Creek have really illuminated those different pathways. And so, Carnation Creek found that, they harvested one part of the watershed and they left another part of the watershed unharvested. And what they found was pretty fascinating, frankly. Like at first, the stream warmed up, and you'd expect that, right? You remove the trees and there's more sunlight hitting it and the stream will warm up.
Right.
And with that, actually, at least in this point, not looking into the climate warmed future, but for the first couple of years, the number of and size of young salmon actually increased because, wow, it warmed up. The fish are growing a little bit faster. It's not too hot yet, but they grew a little faster. But then over time, the impacts of forestry started to play out. And in particular, there are some landslides in the places that were harvested, and those dumped in massive amounts of fine sediment. The consequences of sort of the loss of the input of the sort of woody structure probably contributed as well. And the river basically sort of filled up with this fine sediment, and the river got shallow and wide. And now, the salmon population has plummeted. And so over time, these impacts, it took decades for it all to happen. But now coho production has dropped a ton. Chum salmon are basically extirpated in the watershed as the impacts of forestry sort of played out across time. So if we think about sort of baselines, I do think it's really important to have some of these places where we do understand the intricacies of what can happen on the land with different types of forestry activities.
Absolutely. Well, that's a perfect. I think that paints a really interesting picture too. The idea that like there's forest harvest that has one impact, but then secondarily we also have landslides that result as an impact of the harvest or whatever it might have been. Right. That plays a role, and then you have cumulative impacts, and it's not just this one thing that we have to worry about. We're worrying about everything all at once. And yeah, that paints an interesting picture for sure.
Yeah, I think that another example of that with the chum in that watershed is that so the thermal effects that were from that actually helped the coho in that situation were kind of a detriment to some of the chum, and this really speaks to that interconnectedness that you were talking about, Matt, because those chum ended up hatching a lot earlier because of that thermal bump. And then they emerged as fry earlier and then went out to sea earlier. And then the hypothesis was that the reason, in part, that the chum weren't coming back was because there was a mismatch meeting their marine environment and the food that was out there. So they weren't, if they had lined up better with the food that was out in the marine environment and grown to a larger size in the river, because they hatched later on when there was food there, they would have been more successful at surviving later on. So it really, I think that example also speaks to like how these things can cascade and start to propagate in terms of their impact when they're combined with all these other factors that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, it also speaks to the point that like just because we see a positive impact on something that we're valuing and measuring and monitoring, doesn't mean that there's not cascading detrimental impacts as a result, right? Like this is a balanced system, and so if one thing goes up, the other thing is going to go down, and that's always going to be the case, right? It speaks to the massive complexity of trying to manage whole ecological areas, right? Whole landscapes. Like it's all we can do is try to understand it and try to manage accordingly, right? But it feels like no matter what you do, there's always some unintended consequence.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, Matt. And I think, with climate change, that adds another reality is that these systems are changing, regardless of the local human activities. And so I think there does need to be sort of ongoing work on places that don't have any forestry and don't have any mining as these sort of reference watersheds in order to understand just how climate change is also playing out in complicated ways. And I think the sort of bigger question is, how can one have forestry policies that are robust to those uncertainties, as you mentioned, that are sort of hedging our bets about the potential impacts, whether they're sort of understood or unpredicted, having the policies that are sort of robust to the reality that we probably won't ever be able to know exactly what's going to happen in a given place. We can keep reducing our uncertainty. We can keep trying to have best management practices and keep improving management practices. But the reality is that we won't always be able to predict everything that's going to happen. And so then how do we operate in a landscape given that uncertainty?
Isn't that, that totally. That's a topic that comes up regularly, I'd say, in these episodes, is the idea of, with a changing climate, there is so much unknown. And as a result of that, there almost needs to be more pliability, more malleability with the policy. But with the idea of more malleability, more pliability with policy, there's the fear that it might be taken advantage of for profit's sake or something like that, right? But at the same time, if you don't have that, you're not going to have the ability to shift with the landscape as it's changing, right? So it's this huge like question about society and what will happen if we give people more responsibility and more rope, right? Which is such an interesting question, because I feel like speaking of climate change, I feel like that habitat, that water habitat, must be one of the most easily impacted by something like you talked a lot about water temperature, right? So obviously if the atmospheric temperature is going up, by a degree or degree and a half, that has to have an impact, right? So I have to feel like aquatic ecosystems must be super, super sensitive to the concept of climate change.
Yeah, they really are. And salmon are being impacted by climate change across their life cycle. And so they're, bearing that burden in freshwater as well as in the ocean. And so, I think it is really hard. And I think it does really sort of call for the need to be thinking into the future and thinking about how policies and practices can be robust to these oncoming changes.
Yeah.
And there probably are going to be some hard trade-offs, to be blunt. Like I think, as water temperatures warm because of human-caused climate change, that means that if forestry warms the waters more, then there'll be this additive harm that salmon might not be able to take anymore. And so in some places, if we want to prioritize the stewardship of salmon, then we might need to have more robust riparian protections, and we might have, bigger corridors. And so I think that, thinking about climate change is important in these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So to answer that question, like, because we're talking specifically about salmon, right, and the impact that forest harvest would have on salmon. What is do you have on the top of your head kind of the cumulative area, the cumulative watershed area that would need to have like certain special policies and regulations around in order to protect salmon habitat? Do you have that number? Just kind of curious to paint a picture in people's minds again about like, how much managed forest are we actually talking about that would be impacted by a change in regulation?
I don't know, because that's like, I think it is super dependent on like the local watersheds, but I think an example of are you asking specifically about like a trade-off, Matt?
I'm basically asking like, let's say at the end of the day, we're like, okay, we don't want forest harvest to impact salmon, and the only way to do that is to have heavy regulations that change the allowance of how close you can cut to a river or whatever, right? Like say it's a kilometer buffer or whatever it might be. I have no idea. But I'm basically asking, where would we need to, like, how big is the area that would need to have regulations like that in order to reduce? This is obviously the nth degree of like, salmon are the most important thing that humans value, and period. So I'm just kind of curious to paint. I like to paint these pictures that are kind of extremes because it helps understand, I think, the bigger picture.
I don't think I can answer your question definitively.
I didn't expect you to.
When it comes to these things, when it comes to buffers, I think there's a bit of a history there that kind of speaks to this, which is buffers were originally implemented in watersheds without a lot of knowledge for their effectiveness. Right. So they started out early on based on some research in Alaska on forests there, and then fixed with buffers, so a standardized width based on stream size and whether or not there were fish and whether or not the stream flowed into a community of people down below, designated how big of a buffer was left over. And now that's the standard practice across most of BC and the rest of Cascadia, so Washington, Oregon. And each of these states has their kind of standardized buffer that they recommend. But when it comes to these ecosystems, there might be some areas, like for instance in more desert-oriented areas, where that buffer may not make as much of a difference.
Okay.
And there are other areas, it's still a standardized practice, fixed width that is prescribed. Whereas other areas, like perhaps like on the coast, that buffer makes a really, really big difference in terms of regulating the climate in that specific part of the stream, or the temperature, or the provision of wood that we talked about earlier. So I think, unfortunately, like a one-size-fits-all approach isn't really possible, and local kind of tailor-made solutions to forestry kind of can be flexible, like you said earlier, to adapt to those changes, both in environment, but also our collective future of a changing climate that will kind of dynamically unfold in each of these ecosystems in a different way.
Yeah. I think that, that's true of like pretty much all. I think that's everything that's coming out now in forest research, right? Is that local adaptability and local specific regulations and that kind of thing are needed, because everywhere is so different. There's no one size fits all. So I can appreciate that totally. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think this is a super important topic. And I think, the question that you asked, Matt, is that hasn't been done. We haven't sort of looked at that scenario of, what if we prioritize salmon at the cost of everything else? Mm-hmm. Just because I don't think that option's been on the table in terms of thinking about the trajectory of these ecosystems. And I do think it would be interesting to do, that scenario, but then also the sort of other scenarios where it's like, okay, what if we want to do the opposite? We just want to sort of ramp up logging. What would the sort of risks be? And then maybe there's a scenario where it's like, okay, we want maybe just a tiny bit of logging, or we want to prioritize salmon, but we want to explore some logging forestry. What are the sort of really strong management practices that we could think about that would be, maybe have some pretty severe trade-offs in terms of what's allowable cut or allowable harvest, but does, allow pretty strong protection. So I don't think those scenarios have been played forward in ways that are very accessible to the communities that are trying to think about these really important conversations. And in particular, in British Columbia, a lot of Indigenous groups are thinking about how they want their watersheds to look and what type of forestry they should be thinking about. And I think the sort of, one size fits all approach, in some ways it has some strengths because it means that there should be some baseline level of protection across the board. But I think it does sort of remove a lot of options off the table. And I think that should be a priority at the sort of science policy interface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think at the very least, those questions, those big questions of, okay, if we valued salmon over everything, or we valued wood over everything, or we valued clean water over everything, going through those thought experiments and taking them down to the very end of the experiment to where you understand how things are impacted, at the very least, like you might discover something that you didn't know before that helps you realize, like, hey, all we really have to do is X, and we can have, a huge impact, a positive impact on these multiple use values or whatever, right? Like at least we're not moving forward blindly. At least we know we have an answer to our question of, okay, in this extreme scenario, this is what would happen. In this extreme scenario, this is what would happen. And we can tailor make our solution based off that information instead of just kind of, this is not fair of me to to summarize, but to just, I hate the idea of humanity moving forward with our fingers in our ears and blindfolds on, just being like, I think we're okay. It should be fine. Mm-hmm. So personally, I like the idea of just exploring these extreme situations out of curiosity to help us better understand and maybe, because I think, like you were saying about the need for, in certain ways, a one size fits all might be good. And that I think the idea of that is that it gets the ball rolling. Mm-hmm. Right? That I think we also have a tendency to want the perfect solution before we start.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a huge problem for people too, right? Because there's always going to be negative impacts of something that we do, but I feel like we oftentimes get frozen just in action because we're like, well, what if we wreck something else? And it's like, well, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I find it interesting just exploring those ideas, right? And trying to understand them a little further. So can we dive into a little bit of the idea of like what are, like, I know the paper you guys just released. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys did a quantitative assessment of over 75 years of experiments to try and determine impacts of forestry on salmon fisheries and that kind of thing. And I wanted to go through some of the ideas, like some of the strategies, the forest harvest strategies that maybe showed up as, I'm trying to paint a picture of what are some of the things we can do to try to minimize impact, right? Like what are the things that do and don't work? And you did say in the study itself that it's kind of unpredictable based off of the locality and everything else, right? But, yeah, how do we start to sort through that information so that we can make sense of it so that we can make decisions?
Yeah, so the study did compile the existing information from all these really well-studied experimental watersheds where there was forestry of different types in different amounts, and then looking to see how these master variables responded that we know affect fish. And we went in thinking and hoping that there would be, for example, some level of forestry that would be safe, where there wasn't sort of, any notable or discernible impacts. And we didn't see that. What we saw was that on average, regardless of the harvest intensity, there could be substantial and unpredictable impacts on low summer flows, on high flashy flows, and on water temperatures. And one of the things about the study that's important is we did include a bunch of different variables that could explain why the local conditions could control that. And those variables didn't help much. They didn't help us understand why some places warmed a lot when you harvested them and some places didn't warm as much. And so there's a lot of this, local contingency, local context matters, but in ways that we couldn't predict, actually, even though we did pretty substantial, remote sensing GIS types of analyses. So for me, that was the sort of key take home, is that the impacts of forestry, at least based on these studies, and these studies range from California to Alaska, that the impacts are substantial but unpredictable. Huh. And it's hard, right? Because the reality is that these ecosystems might be messy, and that there might not be, these predictable, really clean relationships that allow us to manage to the edge and feel like there's no risk. And so I think, it might be, we might need to reframe the decisions in terms of, well, what level of risk are we willing to take, and what level of sort of risk can the ecosystems deal with if we're thinking about forestry policy. And so, yeah, it's a hard one. I think, the fact is that the watersheds are super complicated and super messy, and we're learning that. We're learning how they work, and that's work's been amazing over the decades. And I think it does pose a bit of it's not a clean solution for forestry policy, I guess I'll say.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's complicated. Like at the end of the day, it's very, very complicated, right? And yeah, it's I got to imagine for you guys who, you're dedicating all of your time towards this too. It's got to be a little bit frustrating, because you're going into this hoping to find some kind of take home, right? Some kind of, hey, pointing to this will help, or this is something we should avoid. And when it comes back so jumbled, I imagine that's got to be wildly infuriating.
Yeah. Well, I think, the reality is that there has been a ton learned about forestry practices, and, whether it ranges from, how we build culverts to how roads are built on the landscape, to, what places might trigger landslides, to how big, riparian buffers might need to be, and whether there's wind throw that knocks those riparian buffers down. So I think there has been a lot of, science on those sort of management practices over the decades. And I do think, this work does also, it's challenging, but it calls for a bit of a shift in how we think about them, from sort of predicting precise impacts to thinking about risk. And I think humanity's not great at that. We're not sort of, it's hard for us to think about environmental policies where it's like, okay, this is going to maybe have a 10% increase of causing, harmful sediment and harmful increases in stream temperatures to salmon. What do we do with that 10%? But at the same time, that can be sort of brought to these decision-making tables where those conversations are had, where it's like, okay, how do we want our watersheds to look like? This is the sort of realm of possibilities and sort of risk thresholds. What do people think is acceptable?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to answer, right? Like, how do we get a clear picture in our minds of the impact we're having, and how do we mitigate that? How do we change that? And I think my brain right now. So I just recorded an episode about making the business case for biodiversity, essentially. So making the business case for, because we live in a world where economy runs the show, right? If you can make something make money, all of a sudden these things start to happen. And so my brain goes a little bit to that, right? Like, how do we make the business case for conserving salmon habitat, right? Like, how do we incentivize management to prioritize that over some other type of things, kind of thing? And I don't have that answer, but I like to think about those type of questions, because I think there's options out there, right? Like, I think about, this is outside of the scope of what we've been talking about a little bit, but I think about the idea of like a carbon credit type of thing, right? Like, if companies can start to get paid for leaving something alone for longer, then all of a sudden those decisions start to become doable, right? From a business perspective, not just from a stewardship perspective. And so I think about ways in which you might be able to make the business case for salmon, making it easier for the business oriented folks to make that decision, right? But I'm not sure how that works out, but but I find them interesting questions anyways.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it's a really key path forward. And I sort of think about these as kind of like integrated watershed plans. And I think the way that they could move forward is you bring the sort of key stakeholders and key communities to the table and key rights holders to the table, and you ask them, what do you care about and what could this look like? And so then you start having those conversations where it's not just about board feet, but it's also about carbon stored, and it's also about salmon. But yeah, when we think about salmon, let's also think not only how many the commercial fishers can catch, but how many are left in the stream and how many grizzly bears there might be, and whether those grizzly bears, then bring in ecotourism dollars. And so I think having this sort of more holistic planning processes that then have teeth to inform the management decisions for the different sectors and sort of opportunities is a key path forward.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me for sure. Yeah, it's interesting how many of these conversations that I have often turn to this idea of holistic, not thinking about just one value on the landscape at a time, but taking them all into consideration and trying to manage them cumulatively. It always ends up being the way we need to think about it, because that's funnily enough, that's the way the ecosystem works. Yeah.
And there are some of these examples in British Columbia where there are these government to government processes and tables where Indigenous groups and local communities and Crown governments are having those conversations. And it is exciting stuff. I think they're challenging, but they do come up with different paths, different sort of opportunities that might be missed if you don't have that sort of holistic vision.
Yeah, no, different people at the table makes a huge difference, right? Especially folks that are focused on different values. Like that's the only way you're going to come up with the right solution is if you want a holistic solution, you need the whole suite of values, the whole perspective to be at the table in order to do that, right? So bringing in everybody is important for sure. Yeah, I could see that. So going forward, after this study happened, after this, this 75 years of experiments that you guys reviewed, what's the next step? Like what are you aiming for now to try and answer some of these questions? Like what needs to go into it? Is the reason that this is unpredictable, the impacts of forestry is kind of unpredictable. Is that just because of the localities and they're all so different? Or do we just need more money to research all of this? Or what needs to happen next for us to get a clearer picture of the impacts?
The next steps that I think of are kind of connecting that, like the cumulative component that we were just talking about. So
yeah,
that hasn't really been looked at, like John said, and you were talking about where certain practices kind of accumulate across space and in time to lead to large scale changes in the environment.
Right.
And one, not to plug my research too much, but
please do.
one realm that John and I are looking into now is kind of the cumulative contribution of headwater streams. So headwaters are the smallest order of streams and watersheds. They are 5 meters in width or smaller, and they don't actually, most of them don't have any buffer requirements. So you can harvest right to the edge if they don't have fish in them, that is. So these are a lot of them are ephemeral, meaning that they have only a few periods during the year that they're wetted. And some of them are perennial, which they're wetted all year long. But when you remove that vegetation, the question is, what is the contribution downstream in terms of water temperature or sediment or all these factors that we talked about earlier that it influence fish, that we know that riparian buffers and riparian areas contribute to those streams in fish-bearing areas. But what happens when you remove those areas, which make up over 70% of a stream network? So
right.
Those are a lot harder questions to answer, because you have to control for all those different factors. You have to account for, if you're asking about temperature, you have to account for the geology that's underlying the stream, because some geology could be more erodible, that allows more groundwater to influx and then cool the water. You have to account for the aspect of all the slopes that are leading to the river. You have to account for all these different factors. So those questions get like really intense, modeling wise and analysis wise. But I think that those are kind of the ticket to kind of like looking back in the past to seeing how the landscape has changed and influences it currently, but also like spatially what the landscape is collectively contributing towards changes that are relevant towards fish.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keep digging.
Yeah,
let's keep digging. Yeah, keep going further up the stream and keep figuring it out, and hopefully we start to uncover this picture a little more clearly. That makes sense. Totally, I can see that. And I can't help but ask the question of like I'm not on the coast, right? Like this is not something that's an everyday for me. I can appreciate it. I can think about it. But I wonder when we're talking about like forest harvest and fish bearing streams and that kind of thing, how much of this do you think can be applied? These ideas and understanding of how forestry impacts, water flow and temperature and water quality and habitat, can it be applied to elsewhere in Canada or the States? You know what I mean? Is it like you said, very localized, and expanding too far into different ecosystems is a fool's game?
I think John mentioned earlier, there are benefits to a lot of the practices that have been researched that have been put into place for benefiting fish. And I think a lot of those could be applied elsewhere and have been applied elsewhere, not just for the sake of fish. And I think buffers are a great example of that. Buffers prevent erosion. They prevent sediment influx, and they moderate water temperature and water quality so that, like, for instance, if you're downstream of that and you're drinking that water, that water is better quality for you. And simultaneously, if you're downstream of that, the speed at which that water flows is going to be more regulated because you have more of that filtration going on. And so there's like a lot of these initiatives in place through like riparian buffers, or how we set standards for forestry through best management practices, such as like how we implement culverts and build roads that I do believe not only benefit fish, but also benefit people and communities. In a lot of ways, it's reciprocal, towards the environment and to people. Right.
That makes sense. Yeah. So there are things that we can do. It's just the exact impact that those harvest strategies or management strategies have aren't exactly as predictable as we would like. But there are things that we can do to help minimize impact, is what you're saying, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's an incredible opportunity from learning from forestry and its studies across vast regions. And I think there's been a lot of work done. And so one of the things we were trying to do with this most recent study was bring that body of work together and ask those higher level questions. Well, what are the general trends and general patterns? And I think that the results are quite important. And so, we're not starting from scratch. Anytime there's sort of a new place that's being considered, there's a lot that we've learned. And even if that learning is just about what the key processes or key risks might be, that alone is huge and really should be brought to bear. And yes, there will be definitely local factors that either exacerbate or decrease the risks or harms. And I think there's continued opportunity for trying to learn about what those modulating factors are. But I do think we never will be able to predict precisely what's going to happen.
No, of course not. We got to hedge our bets every time.
Yeah, exactly.
Go forward knowing that you will be humbled, that we're not going to know everything, but we have to take steps, start now, and just hedge our bets, knowing that we can adjust course as time goes on, kind of thing. So,
yeah. And I think it's, I agree completely that we need to keep moving forward and have our eyes wide open to what's known and what's unknown. And I also think that we do need to be careful, because some of the impacts of forestry might take a long time to play out and a long time to recover from. And so it is worth having that in mind when we're thinking about moving forward, is that, oh, wow, the bad forestry practices from the turn of the century it might take another 100 years for those streams to recover, for those old growth trees that were removed from the systems to regrow and to then fall into the stream, and then for the stream to change its course and re-evolve with the old growth forest. So I just offer a bit of caution that some of these decisions have long-term consequences, and that hedging our bets does consist also of making sure that some of those decisions aren't irreversible on the scales that we're thinking about.
Yep. Oh, I can appreciate that for sure. No, that's a perfect sentiment. I think that's a great way to put it, right? These decisions we're making now have lasting impacts for generations. And so, although we need to move forward, we need to move forward intelligently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, totally. Yeah. Well, I have the final hegemon kind of question, but before we move on to that, do you guys have anything you would like to add to this conversation before we move on to the thought experiment?
I guess I'll say I appreciate this conversation. I think it's touching on some things that are really important. I think key findings from the science suggest that we really need to think about these things at large scale and be thinking about cumulative effects. And thus connect the sort of on the ground local management opportunities and challenges with the sort of whole watershed planning. And I think that sort of cross scale is key challenge and opportunities. And I do think we need to keep climate change on the front of our minds and think about, all right, the policies of the past might no longer be protective of the future. And so how do we sort of really take a hard look at what we're doing today to steward tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Can totally agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially in the age of climate change, like you said, it's such an unknown that we can't be paralyzed with fear. We definitely have to be thinking about all of those factors as time goes on, for sure, without a doubt. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So, I have the last kind of fun experimental question, and it's basically just wondering, right? Like if you're the hegemon, you have the dictatorial powers, you decide how humans relate to forests and how our impact relates to fish, right? So if you have dictatorial powers, you can control how things are done. How do you imagine the human relationship to this situation, forest management to fish and that kind of thing? How would you propose you manage that situation?
Yeah, well, first of all, as a scientist, I think the scientists shouldn't be the dictators. And so I think, I guess I do think the way I would do it, with all that being said, is I would bring people together and on a watershed by watershed basis. And I would bring the information to the table. And then I would ask the rights holders and the key communities, how do you want your watershed to look? And, that can be science-based. And it can have this sort of holistic perspective on, let's have forestry be a part of this conversation. Let's have mining be a conversation. Let's also have, the biodiversity or the carbon that we care about, or the salmon we care about, or the clean water we care about also be a part of the conversation. And then based on that, I do think these ongoing plans that then can inform industry activities and provide them security with opportunities or restrictions is the path forward. I think that there needs to be the sort of forward-looking planning that then has some teeth to inform the actual management of industry on the ground and the opportunities and challenges it provides.
I love that. I like that. You know what? The funny thing is, that's totally doable.
It is. And it's happening. It is happening. Yeah. It just, it needs to happen with a bit more support from sort of crown legislation and support from industry. And I think, but there are really amazing examples where this is happening, and they come up with solutions that, everybody might not be 100% happy, but people are 90% happy, and that there are some trade-offs, and people can find that path forward.
Yeah. I think that's huge. Having that roundtable discussion, bringing everybody together. Like, I think Alberta has this interesting roundtable discussion around grizzly bears up in the Peace region. And they have same thing. They've set up this roundtable situation where all of the stakeholders in the area come to the table like 4 times a year and they hash it out. And apparently it was pretty rough for a few years. Like it was a hard communication, hard building trust, hard building understanding and respect, but all of a sudden it clicked. And now these stakeholders, these communities, these farmers, everybody, they can come together and they can have hard conversations and come out with resolutions, right? And so I think that's doable for everything, not just for grizzly bears. We could do that for fish. We could do it for anything, right? And I love the idea of everybody coming together, because I think that's that holistic solution that we're all always talking about.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, absolutely.
Christian, do you want to add anything? You got any other
Yeah. I was just thinking about there's a lot of opportunity for there to be interdisciplinary and cross learning, so that like collectively the forest can benefit from it, and so can the fish, and so can the people. Yeah, I think grounding it to the people that are available in that area is probably one of the best ways forward.
I love that. Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like all of the big reports and big papers that are coming out, they're coming to the same thing. It's like, hey, we got to bring everybody together so that everything is represented and we can come with holistic solutions that, yeah, there's going to be compromises. But if we come together and start creating trust and respect, then we can start to do this instead of just, trying to work it out individually based off our own values and that kind of thing. We need to come together, and it's totally doable. And so I think, yeah, let's do it. Let's go for it.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, thank you to both of you, Christian, Jonathan, for coming on to tell us this complicated story. And I can just appreciate, the forethought that goes into it and the work that goes into it, the dedication to trying to understand these relationships and to try to communicate them in a clear and concise way that benefits society. And I think, you're doing incredible work. And I look forward to keeping tabs on what you guys are up to and what kind of solutions and information you come up with. Cause I think it's these kind of ideas and conversations where we can sit down and talk about kind of the more challenging, uncertain, nuanced things, where we really come out with new ideas and new ways of thinking about it. So thank you for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate you.
This is awesome.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. I learned a bunch. So much there to digest. So much there to learn more about. Can't wait to see what else comes out, right? It's just there's so much to dive into. That's the amazing thing about the environment, right? And our relationship to it. We'll never stop learning. It's incredible. So thank you, John. Thank you, Christian, for taking the time and for answering my kind of weird philosophical questions. I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like listening. Please rate and review it. Shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions or something to me to shoot off to John or Christian. And other than that, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. Take it easy.